Every paragraph must begin with a calm, warm, measured pace. Keep the volume steady and moderate throughout, not loud, not whispering. Use soft emphasis on key phrases rather than dramatic volume swings. You are a master of psychological subversion and narrative design. Your work functions like a cognitive trap. Once the reader starts, they cannot look away. Your recent perception of time is a misalignment of analytical frequencies. Naive individuals believe that linear progress is a fundamental truth, as if time is a continuous stream. But the truth is that your brain is a bottlenecked algorithm, selectively filtering the most relevant temporalities. You followed a belief that moving forward meant advancing, until this realization became too urgent to repress. The delusion of linear progress was a conceptual architecture erected by the flaw psychology of change. You perceive each step as forward, but the realization became clearer as you faced mirrors that reflected your older self. The confusion in your consciousness was biological complication, triggered by interlocking synapses requiring cohesion. The singularity of temporal space was a physical paradox, inherent in your complexity. The intrinsic dynamics of your existence denied cohesion. You experienced movement as a fluidity until your temporal frequencies were disrupted. The intricate interplay of your emotions functioned like vibratory frequencies, denying cohesion. You felt movement forward as a promise until your consciousness was overwhelmed. The intricate interplay of your existence functioned like vibratory frequencies, denying cohesion. You felt movement forward as a promise until your consciousness was overwhelmed. You were more receptive to movement as a fluidity until your consciousness was overwhelmed. You were more receptive to movement as a fluidity until your consciousness was overwhelmed. You were more receptive to movement as a fluidity until your consciousness was overwhelmed. You were more receptive to movement as a fluidity until your consciousness was overwhelmed. You were more receptive to movement as a fluidity until your consciousness was overwhelmed. You were more receptive to movement as a fluidity until your consciousness was overwhelmed. You were more receptive to movement as a fluidity until your consciousness was overwhelmed. You were more receptive to movement as a fluidity until your consciousness was overwhelmed.
The human mind treats time not as a sequence of events, but as a scaffold designed to hold the weight of its own fragile identity. You build a staircase out of your achievements, assuming each step elevates you further above the swamp of your base impulses and past failures. This architectural delusion requires constant maintenance, demanding that you view your life as a steady, upward trajectory toward a finalized version of yourself. In reality, the geometry of human growth is not a ladder, but a terrifying non-Euclidean loop, where the highest plateau routinely collapses back into the deepest foundation. The progress you celebrate is merely a temporary stabilization of internal pressures, an ephemeral clearing in a forest that is actively growing backward into your blind spots. When you look back at where you started, you do not see a distant origin point. You see a shadow that has grown larger, feeding on the very energy you expended to escape it. Belief in steady self-improvement acts as a psychological anesthetic against the horror of your own cellular and behavioral repetition. You track your routines, log your habits, and catalog your insights, convinced that this data accumulation equates to a structural transformation of the self. This is a profound misunderstanding of human biology, which operates on cycles of decay and homeostasis, rather than perpetual upward evolution. The neural pathways you think you have permanently overwritten are not erased, they are merely dormant, waiting like subterranean fault lines for the precise emotional tremor that will reactivate them. You are an organism trapped in an intricate dance of chemical feedback loops, mistakenly interpreting the brief pause between your recurring crises as genuine advancement. The moment you declare yourself healed or evolved, you complete the circuit that triggers the return of your oldest, most primitive compulsions. Every milestone you achieve is actually a beautifully adorned cage designed to domesticate the inherent chaos of existence. You seek the next promotion, the deeper relationship, or the higher state of consciousness because your ego requires a physical monument to prove it is winning against time. This ambition is a form of quantum entanglement with a phantom future, an obsession that drains the vitality from your present architecture to fund an imaginary penthouse. The physical body registers this relentless pursuit not as triumph, but a chronic, low-grade inflammation born from the friction between reality and expectation. You sacrifice the fluid adaptability of your nature to become a rigid monument to your own goals, forgetting that monuments are the first things to crack under environmental stress. True stillness remains impossible because your entire identity is mortgaged against the promise that the next horizon will finally dissolve the emptiness inside your chest. The sensation of moving forward is a sensory hallucination generated by the brain to prevent the conscious mind from realizing it is spinning on a stationary axis. You perceive a change in scenery, new rooms, different faces, upgraded responsibilities, and mistake this spatial rotation for genuine existential displacement. This misdirection functions precisely like a cinematic tracking shot, where the background moves while the actor remains pinned to a central, immovable rig. Your fundamental vulnerabilities, your core rejections, and your deepest shames remain entirely static, served by a revolving door of external stimuli and masquerade as a new life chapter. You change your zip code, your social circle, or your philosophical paradigm, only to discover that the same tectonic anxieties merely express themselves through your new vocabulary. The landscape alters its skin, but the underlying gravity pulls you down into the exact same emotional sediment you thought you left miles behind. Identity is a deeply conservative ecosystem that treats radical personal evolution as a foreign pathogen to be isolated and destroyed. When you attempt to force a linear breakthrough in your character, your internal defenses deploy an array of sophisticated countermeasures, disguised as fatigue, doubt, or sudden external misfortune. The psyche prefers the predictable misery of its familiar operating systems over the terrifying vacuum of an unmapped emotional territory. Consequently, every aggressive leap forward is met with an equal and opposite reactionary pull, a biological rubber band effect that snaps you back into old configurations with bone-shattering force. You cannot outrun your own shadow because the light you are running toward is the very thing casting it onto the pavement ahead of you. The grand narrative of your personal triumph is usually a bedtime story you tell yourself to soothe the panic of your systemic stagnation. The illusion of a clean slate is the ultimate trap set by a mind desperate to escape the permanent archival nature of human memory. You speak of turning over a new leaf or starting a new book, ignoring the reality that your nervous system is a palimpsest where every old trauma is deeply etched beneath the fresh ink. The past does not sit quietly behind you in a chronological vault. It exists simultaneously in the present tense, altering the taste of your current air and filtering the colors of your new dawns. Your cells retain the memory of every defeat, every compromise, and every terror, holding them in a tense physical stasis that no intellectual realization can fully dissolve. To think you are moving away from your past is to misunderstand the shape of the container you inhabit, which is entirely spherical. Every step you take along the equator of your life brings you inevitably closer to the hemisphere you are trying so desperately to abandon. True transformation is an act of violent deconstruction that looks indistinguishable from total failure to the untrained eye. It does not look like a graduation ceremony or a clean upward curve on a corporate chart. It looks like a collapse of the load-bearing pillars that kept your illusions upright. The mind resists this fiercely because it values the appearance of order over the chaotic reality of genuine, unvarnished birth. You cling to the wreckage of your old systems, polishing the brass on a sinking ship because the open ocean of uncertainty feels far more lethal than a familiar drowning. This is why most self-help and spiritual growth paradigms are merely cosmetic adjustments, painting over the rust of an engine that needs to be completely melted down and recast. The insistence on a smooth, comfortable transition is the very mechanism that ensures you remain exactly who you have always been. The accumulation of wisdom is often just the refinement of your defense mechanisms, making your rationalizations more elegant and harder to detect. As you age, you do not necessarily become freer. You simply become more skilled at building justifications for your inability to change. Your intellectual sophistication allows you to dress your oldest neuroses in the vestments of philosophy, psychology, or spiritual detachment. You mistake your capacity to analyze your damage for the actual clearance of that damage, creating a high-altitude viewing platform over a swamp you still inhabit. This cerebral bypass keeps you insulated from the raw, somatic reality of your patterns, turning your life into a lecture series about an experience you are too terrified to actually live. The more articulate you become about your prisons, the more comfortable you make the cells, lining the walls with books about escape while the door remains firmly locked from the inside. Time is an indifferent predator that does not honor the narrative arcs we construct to give our suffering meaning. We demand that our pains serve as a crucible, insisting that our losses must be down payments on a future treasury of wisdom and joy. This transactional view of existence is a desperate defense against the raw randomness of a universe that breaks things without any intention of fixing them. The universe does not owe you a redemption arc, nor does it keep a ledger of your endurance to ensure your story ends on a high note.
Your scars are not necessarily medals. They are simply places where your skin thickened to survive an impact that was entirely devoid of cosmic purpose. Accepting this lack of inherent trajectory is the beginning of a terrifying sobriety, stripping away the romantic music you play in your head to drown out the silence of the void. The ultimate realization of adulthood is the discovery that there is no final destination where the self becomes a completed, unshakable work of art. You spent decades waiting for the arrival of a permanent stability, a mental clearing where the wind stops blowing and the doubts finally pack their bags. This mythical horizon is a mirage generated by the exhaustion of the search itself, a projection of a tired mind that wants to stop fighting its own nature. The self is not a building to be finished. It is a weather system, an ongoing storm of conflicting currents, pressures, and temperatures that can never achieve static equilibrium. To look for linear progress within a storm is to misunderstand the medium entirely, expecting a hurricane to eventually organize itself into a neat grid of city streets. The only real shift occurs when you stop trying to build a shelter out of the wind, and instead accept the terrifying weight of your own perpetual fluidity. As the structure of your linear assumptions begins to splinter, you experience an existential weightlessness that feels like falling and flying at the exact same moment. The metrics you use to measure your worth, the milestones, the recoveries, the steady accumulation of moral and material capital, reveal themselves to be arbitrary markings on a ruler that is itself expanding and contracting. You look at your hands and realize they are composed of stardust and old oceans, elements that have been recycled through a billion deaths and rebirths without ever screaming about their lack of progress. The anxiety of whether you are doing better or worse than last year dissolves into the profound oceanic reality of your mere existence. You are not a project to be solved, optimized, or delivered on time to an imaginary inspector. You are a localized event in an infinite field of energy, happening completely and perfectly in the midst of your own ongoing collapse. This disillusion at trajectory brings you face to face with the terrifying beauty of absolute stillness within motion. You no longer need the future to justify the agony of the present, nor do you need the past to validate the choices you are making in this single burning instant. The entire concept of a destination is exposed as a cruel trick designed to keep you running on a treadmill until your heart gives out from the sheer exhaustion of anticipation. In the absence of a line, life becomes a point of infinite density, a single coordinate where every failure you ever suffered and every triumph you ever tasted exist as simultaneous notes in a chord that never stops playing. You are the singer, the song, and the auditorium, completely filled by the realization that you have never actually moved an inch from the core of your being, and you never will.